What if you could step back in time and talk with some of Kansas City's most historic figures? The innovators and achievers who left their mark on our town, on our nation. What would you ask if you could meet the past? This week, Crosby paints the town with Thomas Hart Benton, Kansas City's most charismatic painter and muralist. His regionalist style brought the everyday life of Americans to the canvas.
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, direct from 3616 Bellevue, Kansas City, Missouri. Well, maybe not direct because there might have been a stop at Kelly's in Westport along the way. But please welcome Kansas City's greatest artist, Thomas Hart Benton.
Good to see you.
Tom, thank you for coming.
You have bourbon? Where is my bourbon? I only walked up here because you said there'd be a drink.
This is a public library, so this is iced tea, but there you go.
I don't know. I don't know if I can get through it at that.
I'd like to take you back. First of all, to December 24th, 1934, you were the first artist to be on the cover of Time magazine. Perhaps the most famous artist in America in the 1930s.
I'm still the most famous artist in America.
Thank you, Tom.
Or at least the best, anyway.
Absolutely, and a modest man, Tom,
yes.
Tom Benton. And your fame was achieved by murals, and you were invited back to Missouri about that time to teach at the Art Institute, the Kansas City Art Institute, and then you were invited to do a mural. Became maybe your most famous work. The mural in the Capitol building in Jefferson City. This ultimately became not only maybe your greatest work, but something of a scandal. You were down in your part of the country where you were born, down in Neosho, with a guy named Ed Barber, State Senator Ed Barber.
Well, we were at a party. I was at a party in Neosho, and that's about all I really remember of that moment. In the midst of my stupid, Barber had come up to me and said, "Tom, you did a wonderful thing for Indiana by doing their mural that I had done a year before for the Indiana exhibition at the World's Fair, a gigantic, monstrous thing of
230 feet long, I think. Was it the longest mural?
250 feet long, 14 feet high.
Largest
22
mural.
panels that weighed over a ton apiece. So it was a gigantic effort. He said to me that, why don't you do for your home state what you had done for Indiana? And apparently I agreed. I had no idea. A few months later, in the mail, almost at the same time, came two letters. One offering me a commission to do a mural at the Jeff City at the State House, and another letter saying, would I be happy to come to Kansas City and teach at the Art Institute? And I wanted to leave New York, and that seemed like a good reason to go.
And you negotiated, I think you asked for $50,000, which would have been your biggest commission up to that point, but they gave you $16,000, which was bigger than the governor's salary at that point.
But I was a better artist than the governor.
There you go. We went around the state, which you'd of course done many times before, to get the atmosphere and the experience of the state. And then what you came up with was extraordinary. There's one scene, one of the Kansas City scenes, where there's the Nelson Gallery and there's a teacher bringing a group of school children up, and that's right next to a bunch of tramps who are warming their hands over a fire, and the Liberty Memorial and Power and Light building in the background. And the scandalous thing about the mural was that you painted in to a scene in which there were dancing girls, perhaps a representation of something then in those days called the Chesterfield Club, and you painted into that Tom Pendergast, Boss Pendergast, J.C. Nichols, the leading real estate developer, and W.T. Kemper, the leading banker at the time, my great-grandfather. And many people objected to these stalwart citizens of Kansas City being painted in a place where there were relatively few clothes on the damsels.
Well, you know, every time I paint something, there seems to be controversy of some kind, you know. My first mural was of a train, and I drew it in charcoal.
And how old? You were about, what, 3 years old or 4 years old?
I was 6.
6 years old?
I was brilliant, but probably not at 3.
Yeah, okay.
No, but age 6, I decided to paint this mural of a train going up a steep incline with the smoke bellowing out. It was a magnificent piece of work, magnificent. There were some questions, as there always seems to be about my work, about the appropriateness of it, since I had drawn it on the staircase going up on the new walls of our home in Neosho. I found out then that critics are fierce about one's work. But there was the question on Pendergast and the others, and my response has always been, you know, I've been to gentlemen's clubs. I'm sure there are a few gentlemen here, probably won't admit it, who have been to these clubs, and I believe that I had put considerable clothing on those girls from what I remembered in gentlemen's clubs.
When you were 9 years old, you painted a train from 3 perspectives that was so accurate that scholars today are able to identify the train from the Katy Railroad that you
Well,
drew.
I said I was a brilliant artist. I hope I made that clear. I've always had, you know, we Bentons are always pretty certain of ourselves. We've always been that way, and I've never doubted my abilities. But I've always been fascinated by trains, always been fascinated.
You mentioned the Benton family. You come from a very interesting family in Missouri's history. Senator Thomas Hart Benton invented the concept of manifest destiny. Was your great uncle? Is that right?
That's correct.
And your father was a congressman.
That's correct.
So you spent part of your youth in Washington, D.C.
Yes, many years.
And your library, if I remember correctly, was the Library of Congress.
It was an interesting childhood to be in Neosho for part of the time, the summers mostly, and then be off in Washington, D.C.
Well,
my father wasn't an easy man to get along with, but he believed in the people and believed in advocating for the common man, and so in that case, it was a positive thing for him.
A great populist Democrat, and when you went to the Library of Congress, you checked out the Arabian Nights, which was a little adult for a boy your age, but told great stories, and you became a great story painter.
And because it gives my mind, especially when I'm working on some big project, because it sets my mind almost afire. The colors that I see off of the page excites me, and I rest soundly and wake up early in the morning just with incredible energy to get back to work. And so the book has been very important to me.
Well, speaking of work, your father's defeated for re-election in 1906, I think it is, and you go back to Neosho, and you begin looking in Joplin nearby for a job, and you hang out in an establishment called the House of Lords, actually I think a bar.
Yes. In the House of Lords, over the bar, was this picture of a beautiful woman wearing a mask and nothing else. And I was captivated by it. And by this time, I had been sort of persuaded not to be an artist by my father. My father was dead set against it, because my father, you know, his experiences with artists were always these portrait painters that he had encountered along the way, a bunch of bootlickers who hide behind women's dresses and lisp jargon about beauty and eternal grace, and, you know, those limp-wristed kind of fellows. Anyway.
Tom, I got to tell you, it's a politically correct era that we're in here, so
I'm
anyway.
just telling it like it is.
Okay, so you're in the saloon.
I'm in the bar.
You're in the saloon.
And I see this picture, and as I was saying, while I was prefacing my story here, am I telling it or you?
Well,
okay.
Please, go ahead.
But I looked at her, and I was fascinated, as a 16-year-old boy might be from many things. And then I heard this snickering down at the end of the bar by a bunch of roughnecks who were in there from the mining areas around there. And they were there making fun of me and saying all sorts of crude and profane things at me. And to sort of justify why I was there, well, I quickly responded, well, no, I'm not looking at her. I'm an artist, and I'm checking out his technique. And they proceeded to laugh even more and hoot at me. And so one of them then said, you know, if you're an artist, boy, there's a job open at the Joplin American across the street for a cartoonist. Why don't you go over and apply and show us?
And so you got your first job.
So that's what I did. I went over the next day, and after that moment, I never looked to any other endeavor but art.
So you became an artist in a saloon. in Joplin, and,
Yes.
and a cartoonist, actually, originally.
Really, a
You were
cartoonist,
able to,
yes.
out of that, to convince your father and mother to send you to art school after an obligatory year at military school. You go to Chicago to art school, and
Trained
there
with Father.
you're not terribly happy, but you have a teacher, Mr. Oswald, I think it is, who gave you the idea of going to Paris.
He believed I had as much talent as I believed I had, but he thought it was undisciplined. Well, I never went much to classes. I realized the classes very quickly weren't teaching me anything. That I knew as much as that, and as much as the instructors. But he encouraged me to go to Paris. And so after a year,
So
18 months really in Chicago, I went to Paris.
You went to Paris. I want to quote you.
Talked my mother into paying for it.
So you go to Paris. You get a little bit of an allowance from your family, and you said in your autobiography, in Paris you do what every young student has to do. You found a lady friend to look after you and run you, a studio, some work, and a lot of talk.
A lot of talk.
So you go to
Artists talk more than they paint. Most artists talk. And the modernists, oh, they talk incredible great deal. We don't even talk about the social realists and the Marxists. They really talk. But yes, we talked. I loved my 3 years there. It was a marvelous, marvelous place, and I gained an art education there, really, when I was told to get out of the art classes. I was told that I was wasting my talents, that what I needed to do was go down and study the masters. So I would go to the Louvre every day or other places and just study what they had done and look at it closely and how they handled color and composition.
And one day you went to American Express or wherever it was, and to get your allowance from home, and found a note from your mother. I think you'd been telling your mother about the art parts, but maybe not about the life parts.
Yes, we didn't talk too much about the drunken debauchery that was part of the art scene in Paris.
Or Jeanette. Did you tell her about Jeanette?
No, she did not know about Jeanette, and of course I hadn't been to get my mail in quite a while, so when I picked up the letter from Mother saying, your sister Mildred and I are coming, they were damn near there by the time I got the letter. But Mother found out about her anyway and forced me to come home.
So you're forced to come back, and you decide perhaps you can come back to Kansas City. Kansas City's maybe not quite the right place yet for you to...
Well, no, I came back to try to bring Kansas City into the modern world of modern art, of all the Parisian influences. I mean, Kansas City, I was offered a position to teach the latest art from Paris and the continent, and the latest modernist styles from Impressionism on to Synchronism and all these other things. I must, we're politically correct, but let's set the record straight. I accepted the position. Kansas City would have been fine for me then, except at the party for me the first night, all the men seemed to, how do I explain it? They all came dressed in women's underwear.
Uh-oh, here we go again.
I have been all around the world and I've seen many things, but this is the most extraordinary sight I had seen, and I decided I was not ready for Kansas City. So I went to New York.
So you went to New York. Yeah, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. So you get to New York and you have no work and no contacts, and you go to work in Fort Lee, New Jersey for a film director named Rex Ingram, designing sets.
Who saved me. Yeah, $7 a day designing and painting sets. It's where I learned to work quickly over big space, too.
And so you're in New Jersey with a real job, a Hollywood kind of job, at the same time that you're meeting with literally the smart set, and you're painting your very modern paintings.
Oh, yes.
At this point. And then you're drafted into the Navy.
Well, I was not drafted into the Navy. Let's make that perfectly clear.
You joined the Navy.
Yes, my good friend Tom Craven and I decided that we would end up being drafted, and the thought of catching a bullet for the capitalist masters of America was not too pleasing to me, being somewhat of a socialist bent at that time and believing more in the people than the rich people who exploit the common people. Anyway, I decided that the safest way to get around that was to enlist in the Navy. So Tom and I enlisted in the Navy. Unfortunately, at first, though I had connections from my father in Missouri, it ended up putting me shoveling coal in Virginia. I didn't love that very much.
But then they assigned you to do drawings at the Norfolk Naval Base.
I was sketching, and I've forgotten exactly how it came about, but a fellow saw me sketching, and they said, you know, we really like you to, we want to take drawings of our installations and the ships that come through Norfolk. And would you do that? And I went, well, that sounds wonderful, because I could draw, and I'd do even less for the military. And so I wore a bathing suit for most of my enlistment in the Navy and went around Norfolk drawing ships. But that took me, as you say, that dandy who went into the service disappeared there.
Yeah.
Because starting to draw real things again got me back to what I had done as a child, got me back to painting and drawing real things instead of abstract blends of color. I quit that whole bug house stuff, I like to call it, of modernism, of art for art's sake. You know, modernism is just simply an artist painting for himself. It's totally selfish. There's no connection to the culture. There's no connection to who we are as a people. It serves no purpose except to advance the ego of the artist. So the Navy saved me from that. Slowly I started to come out of that modernism.
Get out of the isms, the Impressionism and Pointillism, all of which you went through, synchronism, Marxism, socialism. But your father dies. 1924, your father dies, and you go back, first time to be back for a while. You're with him before he dies, and you're in Missouri, and you're looking around, and again, maybe this idea of realism hits you.
Well, I had been, by 1924, I was already starting to chafe at Marxist ideology and the socialist ideology that you had to advance a political agenda. Because even that was devoid, this political agenda was of a gap from people's lives, the ordinary activities of farmers and laborers who weren't thinking about the rise of the proletariat or the dictatorship of the proletariat in this manure that the Marxists were putting on. And I was starting to chafe under that as well. They were critical of my work because it did not have enough political polemic to it.
So you make these travels around America, and you come back to New York, and you begin doing drawings for larger canvases, and Lloyd Goodrich and Lewis Mumford and others begin to talk about your art as having to quote Lloyd Goodrich, some of the sweep of life on the Mississippi. And you begin to paint these scenes of Southwest Missouri and Texas. And Mumford actually says that you're on the road to creating an organic art form with murals, even though he hadn't actually really done a mural up to that point.
Well, by then I had already done my American Epic series, and I had already started to work on it, which is 18 plates. And it was based on the relations on the frontier, if you will, between Indians and whites, and their interactions, sometimes violent, sometimes not. It had slavery in it. It had many aspects of all my work would come after that, a strong slice of society and culture. And yes, I, as you say, my trips, when I came back to Missouri for my father's funeral, and then started to travel more and more, and took these lengthy, as you say, 3-month journeys at times. One of my favorites was in 1928 with Bill Hayden, one of my students from New York, and we traveled down from Pennsylvania through West Virginia, through the coal fields, into the Smoky Mountains, down into the cotton picking areas of Georgia and across to Tennessee, took a riverboat ride on one of the last riverboats, and then went out west to New Mexico, and then finally, after a few drunken days with some cowboys, headed north, found a road, and slowly made our way back to New York. But on these trips, we drew sometimes 100 drawings a week, and I saw more of the American character, the true American character, true realism of what America is about, and what our soul was, and what its heart was of its people, and what they did in their daily lives. And I realized that that was what true art is, socially, culturally relevant. And I started to paint it. And yes, it suddenly became a regionalist school. I had no idea what they were talking about.
You were criticized for these paintings for not putting Franklin Roosevelt or Lenin or the great figures of history in.
And then I was criticized on the other hand. I was criticized by some for my racist depictions of Negroes in the South or other places. When what I was trying to paint was what I saw, and I was not trying to sugarcoat it in any way. I was painting what I saw. Now, maybe you would seen a scene and painted it differently than I would, but of course, that's what artists do. It's always filtered through their experiences, their eyes, their minds.
And Tom Craven, your friend, writes books, Men of Art, Modern Art, celebrating you. You get on the cover of Time magazine. Your reputation in one way is rising as the greatest painter in America, but on another side, the New York art establishment is not terribly happy about you. You begin to take criticism from them.
They just constantly whined on and on and on about the aesthetics of this art that look like nothing, of drips, things that make no sense. And any imbecile with no talent at all could go and be a modern artist. We all know this. And I pointed that out to them on many occasions, and they didn't like that.
You mentioned drips. Now, the most famous drip painter in the history of painting was, in fact, your good friend, your student, Jackson Pollock.
He lived in my chicken coop.
Lived in your... That may explain the drips.
You know, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. But at that point in American history, American art history, it seems like the modernists have won. And the abstract art, your student, Jackson Pollock, perhaps succeeds you, in effect, as the most famous American painter, as an abstract painter. You continued to make art. You increasingly in the 50s and 60s, you made these beautiful paintings, nature paintings.
I still make paintings today, by the way.
They must be amazing.
Yeah, and they're amazing. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. But there's one last great mural that you painted. There are really two great Missourians alive in the 1960s, Harry Truman and yourself. And you'd met once or twice, but didn't really know each other. And he was a little worried about you.
Well, we had danced around each other. And I think he was afraid of me, and I was certainly afraid of him. Because he was a man of quick decision, and I respected that. But he was also a politician. And great men, great politicians come loaded with tremendous amount of baggage. Their egos are entirely unchecked. I must say, once we became friends.
It's 10 in the morning and he offered you a drink,
Yes, he did. It was a little too early for me. I don't drink it that early in the morning. I did take him up on it, but
yeah.
My fear was that he wanted to glorify himself. And that's not my interest. And so we danced around it, and then finally he asked me point blank after that situation, well, what are you going to put in the damn thing? And I said, well, I'll come back. And I drew a little drawing of what I would put into it. And he loved it, and he gave me one caveat, the only thing that could not be in the painting.
And that was?
Harry Truman. And we instantly became friends, I think, at that moment. And so we'd have in the children's hour, such as we're having now, after work day is done. Well, that's what I've always called it, the children's hour, when you can have a drink after a good day's work, and a good day starts at sun up and ends at sundown. You know, people ask me, young people who want to be artists ask me, how do you become an artist? Is it about inspiration and grand ideas? It's about work. It's about showing up every day and painting every day.
In the 1970s, you're in your 80s, and most men, including most artists, would have been retired, but you're still working hard, as you say,
Absolutely.
Getting up at 5 in the morning, creating in Nashville, they come to you and ask you to paint the sources of country music. And it's your last commission, your last mural commission. Common people's stories, it seems to me, are what you've always told, that you've had an interest in that from the day that you painted your first railroad, you painted your first train, to the moment you were painting the sources of country music.
There was a point for about 15 years when I got all that modernist dirt on me, and I lost track of that. But by and large, that has been my work, and especially since 1918, especially since going into the Navy and discovering, as I did at that time too, my reading of Marx and Dewey and others who talked about social responsibility. And I realized that true art had to be about the American people. But it would be these different people in the different stories, the tobacco pickers, the people in the coal mines, the people picking cotton. That's why Jesse James and his gang are on robbing a train in the Mural in Jefferson City, and why Black Jack Pershing is not there. And that's what I was most impressed with.
So Tom, it seems to me that in a way you found a way to tell the 1001 stories, the Arabian Nights, of the common people of America, and that you made the American people, you saw the American people being worthy of the murals that had been heretofore really for the kings and queens and generals and financiers. You were the great painter of America. Ladies and gentlemen, Thomas Hart Benton.
Thank you very much. He's a great character, and he gives us something about the American spirit and American values in a nice nutshell. Plus, it's artistic. And secretly, I also love his wonderful, he has an incredible facility with put-downs. He can insult people with just beauty.
To learn more about Thomas Hart Benton, reading lists and more can be found at the Kansas City Public Library or at kclibrary.org.